I am honored always to introduce friends when it comes to giving talks. When I had the distinct pleasure of co-editing a journal issue on intimate partner violence and intimate partner violence and brain injury, Rachel submitted an article with her team and got to know her at a national conference thereafter. And Rachel is extraordinarily high energy and absolutely dedicated to the topic of domestic violence and continues to integrate brain injury and strangulation into her trainings. If you are ever able to meet Rachel in person, you are a you're a very small slice of the population because she's constantly traveling, teaching, educating, running trainings. In this capacity, she is the Director of Health and Disability Programs and the founder of the Center on Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury through the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, known as ODVN. She is always somewhere training, consulting, and supporting programs while implementing statewide projects, and has been successful in recent years gaining funding to implement these projects with her colleagues in public health at the Ohio State University. She's a huge advocate of trauma-informed and culturally aware type of services, and I'm certain she will touch upon this in terms of how to use the right words to be able to connect with not just the victims, but the providers as well. She's co-authored many peer-reviewed articles. Her work has been featured on the radio, in newspapers, and in medical literature. In terms of her licensure, she is a licensed social worker and a registered advocate with senior standing in Ohio, and she's been part of the ODVN for 16 years. Rachel, it's a pleasure to listen to you talk about Hidden in Plain Sight, Ohio's journey to address brain injury from domestic violence and domestic violence programs and beyond. Take it away, and let's talk clearly. Make sure your microphone's working this time.
All righty. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It is quite an honor to be with this amazing group of people and this amazing conference. And I so much appreciate the work that we're doing here to try to bring these different worlds and bring these different fields together. I'm going to get my presentation started, but also just thank you so much to the panel. I'm hoping that was a kind of a perfect introduction to what I'm hoping to talk to today, and really hoping to talk about my transition. I know we have people who are on this conference, or part of this conference today, who have been thinking about this work for a very, very long time and doing work on this for so many years. And we have people who maybe this has never really crossed their mind. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my transition from being a person who was one of those people who didn't think about this work or talk about this work or know anything about this work, to presenting to you all today. And one of the only reasons I'm here is because the group, and with the amazing panel that we had, the people who do this work, we might be a small group, but we're a very mighty and a very powerful group that cares very, very deeply about this, and just appreciate all of the ways in which you all have answered my phone calls and my emails when I first stumbled into this work. And I was like, brain injury, this maybe should have been a thing I should have heard of in my first 14 or 15 years doing domestic violence work, but it was brand new to me. So just to let you know, just a tad bit of my background. I know Johnny introduced me, but I work for the statewide coalition on domestic violence in Ohio. We have 76, every state and territory in the United States has a statewide coalition. Here in Ohio, we have 76 member programs, local domestic violence service providers that provide direct service to domestic violence survivors across the state. So domestic violence is what I do. My very first job was in an 103-bed domestic violence shelter in Tampa, Florida, in 2003. So going on 20 years of experience, and a big role of domestic violence coalitions is to do training, to do education, to do workforce preparation for people who work with domestic violence victims and survivors. So it really is our job to be on the cutting edge of things and what are best practices and what are we learning. And as our knowledge changes and grows and we implement different strategies and interventions and they work in certain ways and maybe also have some unintended consequences to keep our field where it needs to be and making sure that we're providing the best services possible to the domestic violence survivors who we have the privilege to serve. So, I think one of the things that I'd like to, just mention is just really that reality that I had been at the coalition for almost a decade and worked in direct service before brain injury even crossed my radar. And if you had asked me in 2016, what did brain injury have to do with domestic violence? I very well might have said nothing and then moved on to whatever next task I was doing. At the time, I spent a lot of work. I had led a large statewide capacity building initiative on trauma-informed approaches within our 70s member network of domestic violence programs. And brain injury was one of those things that I never mentioned in the 5 or 6 years that I was doing that. So I'm, again, going to talk a little bit about how I got from there to how I've gotten from here and where I think all of us need to go together over the next couple of years. I know one of the things that I struggle with, as you can tell, I wish that I had the opportunity to meet more of you in person, but we have an amazing group here and I just want you all to think about the strengths that you bring to this work. So if people would just be willing to put one strength or skill you bring to this work in the chat box, just to get to know, again, a little bit more about each other and just what the amazing capacities that we have in this room. Just as we are I'm trying to do some of this connection, which we'll talk about is one of the foundation for this work that we need to do around brain injury and domestic violence. So please feel free to be sharing that in the chat box as we move along. And I guess, as just really, as obvious as for many of us, this may seem, the whole concept and the whole idea that being choked, strangled, or hurt in the head can cause a brain injury is, I think, something that, when we were talking in the panel about what is it that needs to be communicated, what is it that we need to do, this is a fact that is just not recognized, acknowledged, or even really taken into consideration in the vast majority of the work that we do with domestic violence survivors. I always say, it's so interesting when I am back to traveling a lot for my work and can get to chatting with people next to me on the airplane. And, was on a flight recently and was talking to the person next to me who was into interior design and was talking a little bit about this work. And, I was like, I work in domestic violence and do work around brain injury and head trauma. And she was like, oh, that makes so much sense. I was like, I know, right? From the interior decorator who never had anything to do with domestic violence, because she was like, survivors are hit or hurt in the head a lot. And that's something that we've always known and has always been a part of this. So I think it is really just thinking about what this is, but even just the awareness. And this is actually a copy of a small resource that I'll talk about a little bit later that we've developed that really just is something that says being choked, strangled, or hurt in the head can cause a brain injury, which is a thought that most of the people who have even dedicated their careers and lives to working with domestic violence survivors, as well as survivors themselves who have often experienced more head trauma than they can even quantify, have never really put these two pieces together. I also wanted to acknowledge, we already have had one survivor, Dawn or Sparkle, share in the chat box about her experience. Thank you for being here. We know we have survivors that are on this as a part of this conference. We know that many people get involved and connected to domestic violence because they have their own personal experiences with domestic violence or abuse, whether as a child, whether in their own abusive relationship, whether they had a friend or family or a colleague. Everybody knows somebody who has experienced domestic violence. And it's really important to recognize that talking about strangulation, talking about traumatic brain injury, talking about the head trauma and the physical trauma and the emotional trauma, and the fight, all of those pieces, it's terrible. It's terrible to experience. It's hard to talk about, and we are not only talking about the people that we're working with, we're talking about those of us doing this work. And to this day, every single training I've ever done in person, I've had somebody who is working in the field of domestic violence come up to me and talk to me about how this shed light on their own personal experiences or a family member's experiences of abuse and put a couple of things together that hadn't been put together. So please, as Catherine said, please do take care of yourselves. I will make sure everybody has my contact information if you want to follow up with me. We have learned that most survivors find this information incredibly empowering, often relieving, as we know that gaslighting and, you know, kind of the emotional abuse and manipulation is so much a part of domestic violence. Many survivors who have been struggling with the impact of potential brain injury that has not been taken as real in so many different systems in which they've reached out to. So I just did want to acknowledge that, and I think your stories matter. As we were talking about, we need to better understand what this is and what this looks like and how this impacts people's daily lives. And we need to learn that from you. So you survivors are such a critical and incredibly important part of the solution and these next steps. So, you know, as I said, I spent many, many years talking about gender-based violence in the context of domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and human trafficking, in all those areas. And we've spent many, many years in domestic violence talking about the intersection of gender-based violence and trauma and traumatic stress. Again, that being something I always like to say, I think that the domestic violence field, like we kind of, I don't want to say invented trauma-informed care. For those of you who aren't familiar with trauma-informed care, trauma-informed approaches, it really is a framework that recognizes the way in which people's experiences, particularly traumatic or difficult experiences, impacts them, impacts our organizations, and impacts the way we need to provide services as well as people's lives. But, you know, and I think that we've always recognized that domestic violence has a significant impact on people. And it's not because something is wrong with survivors. It's not because people are broken. It's not because they did something. It was because something happened to them. So I'm kind of tootling along in my career, doing a lot of training around trauma-informed care and developing several approaches and several, you know, resources and practice-based documents for the field on what is doing trauma-informed care look like. And then in at the end of 2016, we got a grant looking at increasing access to domestic violence programs for survivors who had disabilities, and wrote it around two topics, one of which we were very familiar with, which was mental health. We know that it is very, very hard when somebody is struggling with mental illness, very, very connected to domestic violence, but also very, very challenging to access services, very, very challenging to live in a shelter environment, very, very challenging to get the care and the treatment that you need. All that is super hard. And for those of us who work in domestic violence, I think we would say we will, for the rest of time, be able to continue to work and build our capacity around that, working with victims who experience mental illness. And then we actually threw this brain injury piece in there. And a part of the reason that we ended up doing that, we had a prevention program at our agency, a CDC funded, Center for Disease Control and Prevention funded, primary prevention initiative. And they were a part of a statewide committee, a youth committee talking about young people. And there was some recent sports concussion legislation in Ohio. And a colleague of mine got to thinking, we've known for a while that there's a lot of head trauma in domestic violence, but we've never really talked about this brain injury or concussion piece. I never really thought about that. And it was something that kind of sparked our interest. And we're like, I wonder if something's there. I think people very much connect with this topic and this issue, including, like I said, people who sit next to me on the airplane. But, you know, it was one of those things that we were hoping. And if you ever are, you know, I work in a nonprofit, very, very busy. We have a ton of grants, a ton of deliverables, a ton of things that we need to do. And if you're somebody who's always interested in these topics, there's always something new that I'd love to learn about that. You know, I need to know more about that. But I've got my thing that needs to be done tomorrow. And one of the ways that we make things become things we need to do tomorrow is by putting them in grants. So we wrote that grant. And we were also hoping that whoever reviewed that grant, for all your grant reviewers out there, was like, that's kind of interesting. I never thought about it. It was a different take on how we've talked about disabilities in the domestic violence field. And ended up getting funded. ended up getting funded. And this is what we started with, as we said, first time we've ever done a major kind of research initiative. We had a good friend at Ohio State who came from the practice world, who, if any of you work in the nonprofit world, or I don't know how much this occurs in the academic world, like, of course, we got this grant announcement a little bit later than was ideal. We were on a little bit of a time crunch. You know, I had to get a letter from the statewide Department of Mental Health when I was on vacation because we needed it like in 2 days. And we had our pal at the Ohio State University just finished up her doctorate and needed a letter to help us conduct an evaluation, a very, you know, kind of program-based evaluation on this. And we could get a letter for her in the 2 days, and it was on the Ohio State University letterhead. And as I'm sure many of you know, when you write grants, like a lot of times you submit them and then, you know, don't worry, if we end up getting this, we probably won't, because a lot of times you don't get grants. We'll figure it out. So we did end up getting this grant. And as we were sitting down to look at the grant, and I think really had no idea what the implications of this work were. It was actually when we found out we were awarded the grant, I didn't remember submitting it at first. And somebody told me, like, remember when you had to get that letter from Mental Health and Addiction Services when we texted you when you were on vacation? I was like, oh, it was that one. Getting that grant really made us stop and think about it. And we were like, whoa, this might be a little bigger and this might be a little different than some of the projects that we have done in the past. And as I was working with it, I know you'll have a chance to hear, I know Juliana Nemeth, Dr. Nemeth from Ohio State is on a panel that I believe is tomorrow. We'll be talking a little bit about our, you know, kind of our community-based research work and how she was able to get some research out of a very kind of community-based practice grant. We started to look at this and we're like, we might need to do this a little differently than we do most of our grants, where we jump in and just get started. We had an opportunity to do some planning. We were looking at the special conditions of the grant, and it seemed like we needed to do a research process, again, according to Dr. Nemeth, and took that back to my agency. And my agency's first response was actually like, no, we don't. We never do research. It's too hard. It takes too long. It's too, like, it's not something that we do. But we trusted Dr. Nemeth, and she was, you know, kind of made a good case for that what we were trying to do was share things that were generalizable. So we ended up doing that. And we started with kind of a needs assessment process. And, you know, I think that one of the things that, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch my screen over. And I'm going to share a quick 3-minute video about what we learned when we started talking to, we had 5 programs we were partnering with on, let's see, what does this need to look like in the day-to-day work of our domestic violence programs that we're working with? What is creating accessibility for mental health? What is creating accessibility for survivors with brain injuries? What does that even look like? And we started again. I know somebody said on the previous panel, you just have to start by listening. So we went out, we talked to advocates, we talked to survivors, and this is what we heard. So let me just stop my screen sharing for just 2 seconds. And I'm gonna transfer over to a different screen. And this is what we learned.
You hear people talk about evil in someone's eyes, like, he looked through me like I wasn't even there. And I remember him putting his hands around my throat and like thinking, like, I'm going to die.
When we think about the first picture of a domestic violence victim, the kind of classic iconic image of a battered woman is a woman with a black eye, right? Which one of the things that I realized now in the context of this work is she very well could have had a concussion in the context of that black eye, but it is something that none of us in the field have thought about.
And I don't remember much after that, but a nosy neighbor saved my life. Like, somebody had heard all the stuff going on and knocked on the door, and that was the only reason I'm still alive.
And how we hadn't, it's one of those things you say it, you look at the data, we talk about brain injury and hits to the head, and it becomes very obvious very quickly. But even in my role at my organization as a statewide leader, having led a trauma-informed initiative across the state, trained in other states about the work that I was doing, never once had I mentioned brain injury. And how did we manage to miss that?
81% had reported being hit in the head. 50% or so many times that they couldn't remember. And 83% of the survivors working with the organizations reported that they had been choked or strangled so that their brains had been deprived of oxygen.
And the sad part for me is I'm an EMS educator. Like I teach trauma. That's like one of the things I love. And yet, even though as much as I know about trauma, I totally missed the strangulation part, the brain, and the effects that it's had on my body.
Many survivors who have been living with unmet need regarding brain injury intervention for a long time do end up developing comorbid issues like mental health issues and substance use issues, struggles with suicide. So unless we're identifying the underlying brain injury early, there can be other long-term health impacts for survivors of domestic violence who are not receiving the services that they need.
At one point, I attempted suicide. And so it was like, if they would have found this earlier, like, you know, my family has watched, my friends and family have watched me, you know, try to end my own life and stuff. And it's like, that all could have been avoided had the right people had the right knowledge.
This has just kind of changed how we think about things and how we want to do things. And we're very, very hungry for helping us tackle this, because this really hasn't been tackled in this way before, and helping us from a practice level figure out what this needs to look like in the very complicated, very challenging work that domestic violence agencies do.
All right. I'm gonna pop back over to my presentation, and if anybody has any questions or wants to share in the chat box any kind of responses to that. I'm sorry, my video is being a little funky, so hopefully it'll come on in a minute. All right. But yeah, so I think, all right. So yeah, I think that, you know, what we learned and what really sticks out to me, I don't know if when you're seeing that, like if those numbers were high, they were so freaking high. And it was really kind of recognizing, when thinking about our domestic violence programs, just about everybody who has coming to our programs has experienced head trauma, with half of survivors saying that they don't even know how much, like they can't even put a number on that. The co-occurring and overlapping oxygen deprivation that comes from strangulation, from suffocation, from people being put in chokeholds, from people being sat on, from some really, really terrible violence, and then layering on the traumatic, just the traumatic way in which people get brain injuries and domestic violence. It just made me just really, as somebody who has done this work for a long time, just really made me just, I don't know, kind of question everything that I had ever done in this work. And maybe not question, I wouldn't say question, maybe that's not the correct word. But the whole point of, like, made me think that there was just this whole layer that was missing, this whole piece that needed to become a part of our understanding of what this looks like and a part of our conversation and be included. I want to make sure, I'm going to correct myself what I said, just it didn't make me question everything I'd ever done. I think that it's important that we make sure that we're building this brain injury response on a trauma-informed platform on what it is that needs to do, because yes, we have been very right about trauma. We have been very right about some of the ways in which social determinants of health impact survivors. We have been very right about all of that stuff, but we have not included this piece, you know, and we've missed that repeated head injuries and strangulation, of which we've known that there have been repeated head injuries and strangulation lead to brain injury. I am sorry if my camera is not functioning well. I do like 800,000 Zoom trainings, and this is the first time I've had this problem, which of course makes total sense when you do technology. So anyway, I'm just letting you know. I'm trying to be here, but I'm still here, and I'm going to continue talking. And I'm sorry if you can't see me. But I think, also really acknowledging how brain injuries change how survivors think, feel, and act. And another thing that I'm going to try to do, and again, just the importance of bringing survivor voices into this room, is really during a part of my presentation, having the opportunity to hear from some survivors about how they experience not only the brain injuries that they're experiencing, but also the head trauma piece and how that plays and what it is that looks like. So I'm going to pull up one more short video from, and this is not as fancy and as nice as my pretty Ohio State video, but from survivors who have shared with me. This is me, myself, and I on my iPhone at a conference after the very first time that I had a conference where I talked about this piece. And what they said, you'll hear from Paul again, who you heard from in the last video, who's a survivor who lives here in Ohio with me. And we've done training in several different states around this topic. But we had two survivors who came to a conference, a national conference, and there had never been any presence of brain injury at that conference. And so I met them and got their phone numbers and met them after the conference session in a room. I was like, I need to document some of this. So I want to share this with you. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me get, I'm about to pull up the wrong thing. But I'm going to share this with you about kind of what they shared with them and what they shared in their, in the session that we were talking to about what brain injury looked like for them and what it looked like in their lives. What were some of the things that they weren't aware of and might not have known about. So I'm going to get this started and just what their experiences were, what it was like for them to live with undiagnosed head injuries.
As I got further on in the relationship, I started noticing a lot of weird physical symptoms, but I kind of equated them just to be from the drama at home, from the drama and the trauma. I was working in the hospital as a nurse, and a patient would ask me to write down a phone number for them, and I would have to keep writing it on more than one sheet because my numbers would get really jagged. My hand was clumsy. I thought I was just exhausted from the trauma.
I just thought I was clumsy all the time, but my thing was just the fact of then when it was going on and after I got away from him, I was like, something's wrong with me. I'm not remembering to do things. My eyes twitching, I'm having these awful headaches and I'm stumbling on things. And I didn't know that was anything to have a brain injury.
I didn't want to deal with what happened, so I did a lot of binge drinking. So I was having nightmares and stuff, drinking to pass out, taking caffeine pills in the morning to function. 2008, it started affecting my job, so I stopped drinking like I was. I was having flashbacks, I was having nightmares, and I wasn't able to hold conversations. A lot of mistakes. I was passing out. Like I would be, I would change positions and I would just fall over.
My vision started to get a lot worse. People were noticing my eyes looked funny. My pupils were different sizes. I even went to my family doctor because I thought I had an eye infection, and he even kind of looked at my eyes funny, and then he just waved it off.
One particular one where I went to the hospital thinking that I was going to have a stroke. I couldn't, the left side of my face, it was numb. I couldn't walk right, and they diagnosed me with a simple migraine, which I didn't even have a headache.
Everybody around me started to see symptoms that I was not aware of, especially aggressive, as it was explained to me.
I was yelling, like people would say certain things, get angry at them and yell at them, and sometimes I would just start bawling over something that should have been easy.
And I think, when I come back to that, and again, I'm going to try and I'm going to hope that third time's the charm or whatever time's the charm and my camera will work. But, I think that what sticks out for me as somebody who has a background in shelter and has a background in shelter and was thinking about all of the shelters that we're working with. Like, people who are experiencing things like this often don't do well in our services. And we have a lot of assumptions about what is happening and why they're doing these things and why they're having problems. But it was just like this huge moment for me when I just was like, people can't access domestic violence services or having problems accessing or being successful in domestic violence services because of this combination of brain injury and trauma and all of the struggles with social determinants and of health and what that is. And we are literally services that are set up to deal with this, and we're not taking brain injury into account. So, and I think that, and I know that that was, maybe it was a slide that I skipped over, but I think in one of those videos, Paula always says, had the right person, had the right knowledge, that this all could have been different. So I think that it was really one of those things that is just really, really transformed how I think about this, and how we are also recognizing that brain injuries and domestic violence and trauma and all of the losses that people suffer with the things that they have to do in order to be able to get safe from domestic violence, it just really changes people's lives, and it affects access to services and how people can fully engage in services. It affects people's daily activities, and these are all things that we're trying to help people with in domestic violence services. And I think that there's another piece that's really, really important to acknowledge, is that, with all of you who are a part of this conference, is that a very, very, very small percentage of domestic violence survivors actually get to domestic violence services, get to our programs, get to our agencies. It's one of the things that when I think about what everybody can do, those little steps, those baby steps we were talking about, everyone can become educated on their local domestic violence resources, but you are a resource for somebody who is experiencing domestic violence and head trauma. You are the first people that they talk to. It's friends, it's families, it's colleagues, it's people that people know and trust. But when we see people we're working with, or when we see friends and family that are having these impacts, it impacts all of these different areas of our lives. And these are all things that we're trying to work with domestic violence survivors on in a shelter setting, or in a domestic violence program setting, or, impacts legal advocacy and impacts all of these services. And just really taking that into account, that brain injury, we talk about this whole hidden in plain sight. For those of us who have worked in domestic violence, working with survivors who are impacted by brain injury is not a new population. If anybody has ever worked in domestic violence, you have been working with survivors impacted by brain injury since the day you started this work. We just have not been aware of that, and survivors have not been aware of that. So that is the challenge. Again, thinking about this grant we had, the challenge was to figure out, what does this need to look like in our programs, and how do we need to develop processes and ways to do this that can help support the survivors to be able to get access to the services that they need, because our services save people's lives. A lot of times, if our services don't work for people in the domestic violence service world, care providers, the only other place people have to be is with their abusive partner. And so we have to be able to take this into account. We have to be able to think about what it is that this looks like. And I think a big kind of like overarching, piece of this all was, when we talked about people, like kind of the won't or can't of this, thinking about, are we working with survivors from a framework of people won't do these things? People could if they wanted to, people could if they cared enough, people could if they prioritize the right things. Or is it that due to the services and the frameworks that we have set up for people, maybe people can't do these things in the way that we've set them up? Maybe people can't, like, maybe it is just a different way of thinking about things. I always say, for anybody, a very, very, very on the ground practical example, which of course I always like to use, is the whole, issue of, my intervention. I heard at a training actually from some friends in Iowa that a statement that I'll never forget, that our explanation drives our intervention. So why we think things are happening, what's behind what's happening, really drives how we intervene. So if you have a 9-year-old who you're trying to get out the door and can tie their shoes and won't tie their shoes, that takes you to a very different place than if you have a 3-year-old who you're trying to get out the door who can't tie their shoes. Me not tying my shoes versus me not being able to tie my shoes are two very, very different things. And we know that brain injury can look like all of these different things that, again, I think before I started this work, these were just kind of assumptions that we made. This is just the basis of domestic violence services, is we need you to understand, our directions and our rules and our processes. We need you to remember everything that would happen and be able to share that in a way that makes sense and can connect with people. We need your mood and affect to be correct, because heaven forbid you're not, if you're a domestic violence victim that's super angry, like that's not what domestic violence looks like, because you were that angry. How could you have let somebody done that to you? If you're a domestic violence victim that doesn't show enough emotion, then maybe you're lying. Like all of those kind of things. All of these things are very, very connected to what it is that we're doing in our work, in our daily work with survivors. So we also know the overlap between PTSD and brain injury. And one of the caveats I would like to make for those of you who might be in this conference who do trauma work, we talk a lot about PTSD. I almost think that we need to eliminate the P when we're talking. I actually think that we need to eliminate the P and the D, because I don't know if the traumatic stress that survivors are experiencing is really a disorder, because a lot of times survivors continue to be hypervigilant, continue to be avoidant, continue to have some of those symptoms because the trauma isn't over. The domestic violence survivors that we're working with are not in situations. A lot of how we've understood PTSD to be is when people are having kind of maladaptive reactions. People are not at war anymore. They're not in a combat situation anymore. That's over. The trauma is over. The domestic violence survivors we work with, their trauma is often never over. They're still having interactions with the person that has hurt them. They might be still sharing custody, still sharing family, what all of it is that looks like. So maybe we need to get rid of the P, we need to get rid of the D and talk about traumatic stress. But we know, again, because people are acquiring head injuries in really, really traumatic situations and really, really traumatic experiences. If you have ever been in a situation where you have not been able to breathe, it is terrifying. People are trying to heal from brain injuries. And I think I always say, if you look at a domestic violence shelter, our domestic violence shelters are amazing. Not a great place to heal from a brain injury. Only place worse than that is trying to heal from a brain injury in the same situation and with a person close to you who gave you that brain injury. But when we look at this, and for those of you who are doing research, and for those of you, on this conference that are part of that, we cannot separate or tease out the trauma and the brain injury. And we need to be looking at these things holistically. We need to be looking at, this is one bucket. It's a whole bucket of mess, as Dr. Nemeth and I talk about. But we need to be acknowledging that all of these things are happening. So, I think it really challenged us and forced us and to really think about all of these words that we use when talking about survivors who are non-compliant and they just won't do what they need to do, or they're unmotivated, or they don't care, or they don't learn from past errors, or they're not paying attention. And just thinking about again, those executive functions that we have really honestly taken for granted in most of our service provision. So our service provision capacities that people just have the ability to do those things. So, I think that, and this is my last quick video that I'm going to share with you, again, trying to let Nina, Rebecca, and Paul, and then we'll talk about kind of our intervention or our approach called CARE that we really came up with and what that looks like, how we do this work. We'll talk about that. But, one of the things that we had survivors, Rebecca, Nina, and Paula, share with us is, what do you want people working with domestic violence to know about working with survivors who have brain injuries. So I'm going to pull this up. Give me one last second. And this is really advice from Nina, Paula, and Rebecca about how to do this work.
I would say assume a victim has it until proven otherwise. Even if they haven't told you about hits to the head or strangulation attempts, they may not say it. They may be minimizing what happened to them, not because they're trying to protect the offender, but because they're embarrassed about it, they're ashamed. I didn't want to admit to people that it had happened. I also didn't want my family to know the ugly stuff about it, so I minimized it.
Every victim is different, every brain injury is different, and every sign and symptom is different. So you can't fit the mold. And that I know that there are so many domestic violence victims out there, and I know that there is so much to be done. Taking your time and really looking at that particular person in that particular case may save that person a lot of time down the road.
What worked for me is, instead, if therapists were going to send me home with instructions, things like that, they would scan them and email them to me, so that way, otherwise if they hand me a paper, even if I put it organized like in my purse, I'd get home, I wouldn't remember. And so that's one of the compensation things that they did.
Don't instantly stigmatize them as being mental health, because that was what happened to me. You're mental, you drink alcohol, beer or two a day, but you're alcoholic. That was kind of the what I was stigmatized as, is that mental health, you have mental problems.
Healing has definitely been in finding other survivors, both other survivors and advocates.
I know that I would be here if I didn't have a supportive, boss and friends and parents. I don't know how people who are in my position that don't have that support system, I don't know how they make it. If you get the trifecta where I'm tired, it's really loud, and I'm in a cycle where maybe I've not been self-care that week. It can get dangerous to where it almost puts me in bed for a few days. I have accountability partners that check in on me regularly, that know my problems, because I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed and not be able to feel like anyone understands. When I didn't have that support system and I didn't know what was wrong with me, it became more than I could handle.
I'm finishing a master's degree right now in forensic psychology. I'll finish it next semester. And I'm really excited about looking toward public policy and looking at both, what's going to produce the best outcomes for victims, but also for offenders as well.
Victims, I hope, come forward and can get the help. I wasn't able to get the help.
I firmly believe that there's good that can come out of every bad. And I want to share my story because I think that there's education to be learned in it.
All right. Yeah, so that is, again, direct from I don't know why I'm saying horse's mouth. I don't know if that popped into my head, and maybe that's not what I want to be saying, but, I think, again, we've talked about kind of the importance of really listening to survivors about what this is and what it is that looks like, and really also needing to connect some of the data. I'm really needing to connect, really understand how this looks different, and how this might look different for those of you who might be here, who might have worked with sports, who might have worked in the military, who might have worked, with falls or with accidents or all of those. This is just a very, very, very different animal. And, we heard the panel, we heard people talking about how do we have to make sure that we are recognizing that there is so much expertise, but none of us have all the expertise that we need in order to come up with what solutions, and I will say that in plural, what solutions need to look like. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to spend kind of the rest of the time, and I don't think that there are any questions in the chat. I'm sorry that I'm looking forward to catching up on the chat, because if I present and try to spend too much time in the chat box, I just get really, I get myself all thrown off, and then lose my train of thought. But the intervention or the approach, intervention is what we say, I guess, research say in science, or the approach that we developed in collaboration and in partnership with our research partners, in collaboration and in partnership with our domestic violence program partners, in collaboration and in partnership with survivors, is called CARE. And it's a framework, and as you can see, it's a brain injury aware, trauma-informed framework that really focuses on awareness, accommodations, and accessibility. And that was one of the things it's really starts by, and we kind of did this again together. We had no idea what this was going to need to look like, but learned from our programs, and learned from survivors that these were some important components of it. The framework starts by connection, by developing connection and relationships, by forming those relationships, by just really recognizing that building relationships with people who have had significant experiences of interpersonal trauma takes time. And survivors have every single reason not to trust us when they come into our services, and recognizing that trust needs to be earned. It's our job to develop those relationships, and just really acknowledging what that process looks like. Then we talk about the A with acknowledge, is we're talking about it really is our job, those of us who are working with domestic violence survivors, to acknowledge that head injuries and mental health challenges. Again, head injuries do not occur in a silo. TBI is not, it's totally integrated and enmeshed with all of these other challenges people are having. But we need to start bringing up, remember, strangulation, being hit or hurt in the head, and strangulation or being choked can cause brain injuries. We're providing that information and education to survivors. The number of survivors I have, again, I have people on a regular basis come and tell me 10 years later that, they've been out of their abusive relationships. They're still having problems with their health. They're having problems with some of those activities of daily living we've talked about. They're having problems at their job, and have done a lot of their emotional healing around abuse, often are in very different stages of their lives. And they're saying, like, I never even considered this. And I haven't shared this with my medical providers, not because of some of the safety concerns or the stigma around abuse, or some of the ways, in which it's very unsafe to share about what happens to others. But it's because it just didn't even occur to me that something that happened 10 years ago could be something that is impacting my life still on a daily basis. So we're talking about how are we providing that, again, that accessible, trauma-informed, domestic violence specific information and education to survivors, and how are we working them to identify, as Paula said, if each brain injury is different, each survivor is different, what does this look like for you? And how are we starting from your place of what do you feel like is getting in the way with your life? I know that we've talked about on the panel this morning that we do not have, and I think brain injury particularly in the context of domestic violence or partner inflicted brain injury is not something that we need to understand as, it's something that we identify and then we send it to some medical professional who fixes it and then they come back to us. No, this is our work. And this really challenges us to really think, not only this is about referrals and this is about connecting people with other types of care, but it's also about looking internally about how we do work, about how we provide services, about how we do research, about how we study this, and how do we respond by accommodating those needs, what it looks like, and what do those accessible, effective, accessible referrals and advocacy look like. It might be more than us just giving people a list of phone numbers and say, figure this out. It might be thinking about how we're doing advocacy in a different way, and how it's really our responsibility to make services work for survivors, not a survivor's responsibility to have a certain skill set that they're able to get services in a certain way in order for them to be able to be safe. And then it's a really, really important part of the advocacy process and the research process and the system building process, which I'll talk about here in a larger context in a little bit, is we're evaluating, we're going back and we're touching base with people. We're seeing if what we did was helpful. We're talking about if accommodations were were, if accommodations, which basically, defining accommodations is just providing services in a way that works for people. If we're helping people around their sleep and we're providing them with eye masks and earplugs, of which we had programs do that with some of the accommodations, then we're checking back in and saying, are those helping you sleep better? And if they're not helping you sleep better, that's okay. Let's try something else. And if they are helping you sleep better, how can we make sure that we're thinking about this as a strategy that can really support you? There's going to be a lot of trial and error for this. People's lives change, people's circumstances change, people's situations change. So, I think it was very much important for us, for people to understand a part of our care provision or advocacy process is that acknowledging and recognizing that things are going to be different and we might have to go back to the drawing board. And if things could work for a while and then stop working, and we might have a really, really great idea that sounds fantastic and it not pan out, then that's okay. But then we just go back and we just reevaluate and we try something else, and we all do that again in the context of that relationship that we've built. We know that there are a few things about care, that it is flexible, and it is a toolbox. It is not this one thing that you do. It's not this one question that you ask. It's not this one intervention that you propose. And even with the 5 programs that we did this with, and both myself and Dr. Nemeth will be more than happy to talk to anybody more about this. You can't get us to stop talking about this if anybody wants, but even how they implemented it was very, very different, because we had large domestic violence programs in urban areas. We had very, very small programs in rural areas. It looked very different, and there wasn't necessarily a right or wrong way to do it, but it really was, how are we increasing awareness, access, and accommodations? I know that a lot of times we were very, very unfamiliar with the brain injury world, like at all, when we started this. I mean, we had very, very surface level relationships with our statewide Brain Injury Association, the Brain Injury Association of Ohio. They actually wrote us a letter for our first grant, which really, really helped. So I had a good enough relationship to be able to get a last minute letter from kind of the president of that. But we didn't know anything about it. And I know brain injury talks a lot about screening, and screening can be one approach to use. But we have learned it is one approach that sometimes works. Asking direct questions sometimes makes sense, but it is not the only approach. And we really, really need to think about if we are doing screening, we're doing screening in the context of this care approach, of this connection, of this acknowledging, of this responding, and of this evaluation, because this information is often very, very new to domestic violence survivors. So in my last few minutes, I'm just going to spend just a few minutes really talking about the connection piece, what building relationships has looked like, and what establishing rapport has looked like for domestic violence survivors. And we know that it is around building connections and reinforcing strengths. And that's one of the things why I asked you at the very beginning of this training, what's something that you bring into this room? What's something that you're proud of? Having those conversations with survivors is a part of having brain injury aware services. We have to recognize that survivors have had bad experiences with connections, that trust must be earned. And we need to learn about them, about who they are, what matters to them, what they care about, and what they enjoy. We were talking about acknowledge, kind of our second piece is really making sure that we're acknowledging this complicated intersection of coercive control, psychological trauma, and head injury. How are we educating, validating, and normalizing and helping reinterpret some of that behavior that we see? And it is our job to bring this up. That was something that was very interesting. This original funding was a part of disabilities funding, one of our current grants that we have working on a really, really exciting collaboration in Ohio with the Brain Injury Association of Ohio and the statewide Forensic Nursing Network, funded by the Office of Violence Against Women through their Disability Grants Program. Really talks about, how, with a disabilities framework, a lot of times there are people who are aware of their disabilities and aware of some of the accommodations that they might need. People who, are deaf or hard of hearing know that they need an interpreter. It's not about survivors coming up and having a list of accommodations that they need to ask for, because most survivors are not aware that this is something that is playing a role in their lives. So it's our job, and it's our job to bring that up in a trauma-informed way, in a way that isn't overly alarming, in a way that's serious, and why that connection piece is so important, but so people have an idea about this. We also are making sure we are not medical providers. We are never going to diagnose brain injuries. That is not our lane in domestic violence. So even how we thought about how we're talking about head trauma, brain injury is a very, very scary issue. A lot of people don't know what it is and don't know what it means. So, and it is just recognizing that everybody we work with has either experienced head trauma or is at a high risk of future head trauma. So we really need to be talking about this with everyone. We really need to be not just talking about this, but again, that toolbox, providing education and information, having people have access to information without having to talk about it with us. Sometimes people don't want to talk about any of this stuff with us. We need to make sure that we're not gatekeepers to access to services and other supports that people need. We also know, and this is just, acknowledging the complexity that people have traumatic events, this complicated intersection of gender-based violence, trauma, and brain injury. We also have the historical and intergenerational trauma that we're talking about, and all of the issues related to social determinants of health and unequal access to resources, the systemic prejudice, discrimination, and oppression that plays a lot of all of this. This is all of the pieces and parts that need to be put together in order for us to properly be able to not only support a survivor, but also think about what a systems response and what the research that we're doing on this needs to acknowledge all of these pieces. We have a few resources, including, you saw this earlier, this is a newer, it's like a business size card that just says being choked, strangled, or hurt in the head can cause a brain injury. Getting help can save your life. And if anybody of you wants to see this, these are all of these resources are available on our website. You can scan that code now, but it takes survivors to a page that was specifically written by us for them. We're not having survivors Google, do I have a brain injury? That has some very well thought out information for them. 10 things to know about brain injury, what to do if you're have been recently hurt. Very much taking a harm reduction framework with this work. We know it is important for people to get medical care after they've had brain injuries. We know that most survivors also don't or can't for a multitude of reasons. And we need to not give up if, I feel so much of this is helping programs think about, we tell them, go to the emergency room, and they don't go to the emergency room. And then we're like, we don't have anything else to do. There is a lot we can do. It takes us to this webpage, and maybe with our last minute, I will pull up our website so you all are able to see that. We also have a whole slew of tools that are available on our website. There are educational tools. There are service provider tools. They are free. Almost all of them are translated into Spanish for you to download. We do have some copies in our office that we can potentially send out. If anybody has funding to print stuff and wants to put their own contact information on that, please follow up with me and talk with me about that as we can get that worked out. But these tools were so significant because programs told us we don't have any resources. We don't have any materials. We don't have anything. The little Ohio Department of Health concussion fact sheet didn't really help us. That talks about sports concussion. We have an advocate tool, which is and you will see me, I'd be doing air quotes in my head, which is an identification and assessment, really a connection tool. But if screening is one of those approaches that you think works for your system or could potentially work for your survivors, I would encourage you to, again, have those conversations and think through this carefully. But it's a tool that we've created that really focuses on accommodations, focuses on service provision, and focuses on also supporting survivors and referrals that they might need. Talk specifically about strangulation, talk specifically about some of the comorbid conditions, like the overlapping conditions, including substance use, including other health problems. And there is a guide for advocates or service providers to how to use that tool. We will be coming out with an updated tool soon, as there are, as we learn and grow, there are pieces that are missing and our information grows and changes. So that's another resource for you. Then when we talk about the respond piece, it really is how are we connecting with services or care, and how are we within our services accommodating for needs? How are we empowering, working with survivors on strategies that they can use in their lives and what those trauma-informed referrals look like? And then on a systems level, how are we incorporating that knowledge into our services? I'm going to show you this card was actually just delivered to my house last week before I was headed to a national conference. We have a brand new card that we've developed that is really about recent head trauma, thinking about, we have new strangulation felony legislation in Ohio. We're the last state to do so. but what information do people need maybe after a recent head trauma, recognizing that there are going to be people that, again, aren't going to seek medical care that absolutely probably should and need to, but how are we using this and making sure people understand that even if people are feeling like they don't need it at the moment, here are things that can happen later. So that is available on our website. I'm sorry, this is not yet available in Spanish. We will be getting that translated soon, but we just, like, this was put on our website on Wednesday. And we talked about accommodations and really thinking about how we're providing support in a way that takes into account a person's unique needs. And so if people are having problems with, and we have another tool that's on our website around accommodations. How are we providing accommodations for common symptoms related to brain injury, when people are having problems connecting, when people are having physical health challenges, when people are having emotional challenges or challenges relating to thinking or cognitive challenges? How are we doing things differently? How are we identifying that people might have problems focusing? And if they're having problems focusing, can we have meetings in a place that is less distractions? If people are having problems with memories, can we help them by programming reminders into their phones or whatever that can help them remember? If people are having problems, with their emotional control, how can we help them become better aware of when it is that they might be getting agitated and what it is that looks like? We also have some promising practices, including some organizational promising practices, policies, and procedures. This is also available on our website in an overview of the care framework. And then we talked a little bit about evaluating, how are the accommodations and referrals working for survivors? And then we're touching base and making adjustments. We're checking in regularly. Are they feeling and noticing differences? We're talking about what is helpful, what isn't working, and what is changing. And again, making sure we understand that is no reflection on us as our quality of a service provider. That just has to do with sometimes things work and sometimes things don't. And we want to have that connection where we're able to kind of redirect and kind of think about some different ways to do things if what we're doing isn't working. It was very, very rewarding. I actually went back in preparation for this presentation and looked at our original reports from our first round of funding. Was funded by the Office of Victims of Crime. And I don't know if you all have written a lot of great reports, but I have very rarely looked at one at the end. And it was so cool to be able to look at this and be like, this still is helpful. These are some of the lessons that we learned about brain injury and mental health. And what it is. And we do have these reports that are also available on our website. We have an evaluation report, we have a findings from the field, and we have an action plan. But we also realize that care is something that can be adapted, kind of not on purpose, but when we think about a successful framework for implementing statewide or multi-agency collaboration projects, for implementing research. When I just think about how we do research, how are we connecting with some of those partners, with some of those people? How are we acknowledging just what the complexities, challenges, and realities are? How are we acknowledging people's history with doing research? How are we acknowledging power differentials in the room? How are we responding by what it is that we've learned, but how are we integrating all of that feedback into thoughtful and intentional design of training materials, and research design, what it is that looks like, and how are we evaluating? If you were to ask me now where I think we're going to be in 2 years, I don't know. But I do know that what we do today is going to impact what I do tomorrow. And I do know that the voices of survivors and the voices of programs are really going to help us figure out where it is that we need to go. So this is all, again, and it was something that we didn't even realize, but we were like, hey, wait a sec, we did care with organizations too. This is a part of what we learned about some of the outcomes. And I know that there are some papers that are out there. And Juliana, I'm sorry that I probably don't have these cited right, because I'm a practice-based person and sometimes miss those things. But we know that care strengthened trauma-informed practices, and it increased staff support, and it facilitated survivor empowerment. And we know that a part of it was reframing behaviors as can't, not, won't. We know staff use the care tools to support survivors in themselves and help them provide accommodations and offer that structural and functional support. So that's really where the future of the work is here in Ohio, is thinking about how are we using care in multiple different places and in multiple different agencies and setting, as well as building a brain injury alliance, a statewide multi-sectoral brain injury alliance about what the future of this work looks like. Because we realize this is domestic violence, this is sexual violence, this is human trafficking, this is structural violence, this is police violence, this is community-based violence, this is what all of this is. So make sure you use your CARE toolbox. And here's my contact information. My email address is very, very easy. It's rachel.r@odvn.org. I am going to put that in the chat box, but I just did for my very last minute. I just wanted to take you to our website super quick, or maybe not. Okay, I think I'm okay. Take you to our website just so you're able to see our website and see where you can find all of these things. I like to think that we have a website that makes total sense to everybody. But again, as a nonprofit, we try our best, and whoever designed that website, it made sense to them. But if you go to odvn.org right up here, and then you click on our work right here, you'll see our brain injury page. And of course, we'll take that there. And then you can just scroll down and you will see a link to some of the video, some different information. We have information about our head injury, what our head injury is. We have all of our resources here that you can just click on and download. We do have an e-learning course that is seven parts, about 10 to 15 minutes each. That's free on our e-learning training academy, our brain injury survivors website and webpage. So that's just where that is. And I am going to, I could talk about this for another 12 hours, but you have some more wonderful speakers that are coming. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to put my email in the chat box. And look forward to being, my email address is rachel.r@odvn.org. Please feel free to reach out to me. This is my favorite thing in the world. I'm sorry none of you can see me. And I'm sorry that my camera didn't work. It's never not worked before, but hopefully I got the technological problems out of the way and it'll work for everyone else. But all right, I'm out.
Rachel, this is Johnny. I want to thank you again for spending your hour with us and teaching. If you're not aware, there's 175 screens watching this from all over the world. The chat box is going very fast and furious with people introducing themselves. And the take-home message that you reinforced for me was what we talked about in the panel in terms of get noisy, get busy, get angry. We can hear it in your voice. We can see it in the outcomes that your team has produced. And we want to make sure that everybody feels the same way. Also, you reiterated the concepts of everybody's going to bring their preconceived notions to any of these conversations. And what I found is that we need to have the flexibility to recognize that IPV brain injury can be very, very different. So thank you for that. As a couple points of organizational strategy, so to speak, at this point, there's a scheduled 30-minute break to reconvene roughly in 27 minutes or so. I encourage people to take some notes and to organize their own thoughts, because these topics, for many of us, bring up feelings that are challenging to deal with. And we want to monitor self-care first so that we can each extend our treasures, times, and talents towards this. And one other thing about the chat in Zoom, I think that the default chat goes to the hosts and panelists. So if you intended to go to everybody, please make sure you're sending it to everybody. Rachel, any closing thoughts since you're the individual of the hour?
Oh, well, I was going to say, I don't know if I'm allowed to, but I will still be here if anybody, I'm not going to continue to chat over lunch, but please reach out to me. And I think that there's so much more that you all are going to learn in the next couple of days. And everybody who is presenting is all in on this. So I think that I just encourage you to be really open to who is coming and really think about the work that you're doing from a different perspective and from a different lens, and I really do think that like 1 + 1 is like 5 in this. So when we get a couple of people working from different perspectives and from different experiences, as long as we're all open to listening and to really hearing and respecting each other's expertise, that's the way we're going to be able to make the most progress.
Yeah. And you also modeled great behavior that is present in this domain, which is sharing of resources. And so if anybody sees anything that they can use to accelerate the conversation, then please reach out. There are many resources available. So with that, I'm going to mute this all essentially for another 25 minutes, and we'll restart. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but we'll restart with the next part of the meeting. Thank you all.